Okay, well, I'm Cindy Seiwert. I'm a professor here at Goodwin College, and I read banned books, many of them. I actually had a hard time deciding what to pick, but I'm a scientist and a biologist, and so I decided I would pick one of the books in science that has been banned and that still causes a lot of controversy in this country, and that is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection by Charles Darwin. Darwin was a Victorian gentleman scientist. He was a scientist before it was an actual profession. You had to be pretty much a rich white guy to do it. And it was mainly a Western occupation at that point. And Darwin is an interesting character in his own right, so I always recommend people go find out more about him. But as a young man, he went to medical school, didn't enjoy it, made him very queasy to look at people having surgery without anesthesia, which would be true for most of us, I think. And didn't want to be a lawyer, and so his father said, okay, then you're going to be a clergyman, because those were the three choices for a wealthy guy at that point. So he did go to school to become a preacher, but he got really involved in zoology courses, studying animals and with what we call naturalism, so studying the natural world, the living world in particular. He gets his degree, he graduates not exactly sure what to do, not ready to settle down and be a preacher. He got a job as a, what people now say, he got a job being a naturalist on board an ocean vessel. But really he was hired to be the captain's companion. These long ocean voyages that folks went on, the crew was usually not well educated, the captain was, and I guess it was lonely, so they would bring somebody along. Anyway, so Darwin goes along on this 5-year voyage, sailing all over the world, and the ship was called the Beagle, by the way, the HMS Beagle, and he started to notice things, and he noticed more and more things. This was a time in the history of Western culture where the idea of evolution was actually starting to become part. In fact, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was an evolutionist. The problem was nobody knew how it worked. You might believe that species changed, but without what scientists call a mechanism, a way for it to happen, there was really no nobody was going to buy it. Also, the idea of evolution, this idea that one type of organism is not what it is, that it changes across generations, and sometimes changes so much that 100 generations later you might not recognize it as being the same type of organism, was a serious problem for the powers that be at that point in time. It challenged a lot of church doctrine, for example. There was this idea that God created species, different types of organisms, and that they never changed. They were perfect the way they were, the way he made them. This troubled Darwin for all kinds of reasons. And he was by nature a scientist. And so he let what he saw influence what he thought, with the result that he developed the theory of evolution by natural selection. So not only, he gave us what we needed, which was a mechanism, a way to explain how species change over time. One of the things that I admire most about his work is that he didn't just look at something and say, okay, this is what's happening. He was very patient. He accumulated a lot of data from a lot of different angles before he was willing to say, even, I think this is the way it works. And I brought a photograph of a page from one of his notebooks, which shows his first drawing of the tree of life. I actually have this on my back as a tattoo. It's that important to me. So you have the origin of life down here, and this branching tree, which represents the different types of life that all came from this common ancestor. And the most beautiful thing to me about it is this part right at the top. He wrote, I think. He wasn't saying, I know, I believe, I'm certain. He's saying, I think. Given what I know, this is my best explanation for what's going on. And that really is at the root of why science is such a wonderful way of understanding the natural world, because we never, when we're at our best as scientists, we never believe things. We never claim truth or absolute knowledge. We say, given what we know, this is how it works. One of the things I say to my students all the time is, it's frustrating, right? What you learn in science changes all the time, and half of what I'm teaching you is wrong. The problem is, we don't know what half. Whoops. What we believe now will be different. And that's the great strength of science. We change our minds when a better explanation comes along, when the world kicks us in the pants and says, that's not how it works. So, with that long-winded introduction, I'm going to read you a little bit from the introduction of Darwin's book, which is hundreds of pages, and a very brief passage from the end. All right, we'll go. All right, so when on board the HMS Beagle as a naturalist, I was struck with certain facts in the distribution of the inhabitants of South America and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. Fossils. These facts seem to me to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers. On my return home, it occurred to me in 1837 that something might perhaps be made out on this question by patiently accumulating and reflecting on all sorts of facts which could possibly have any bearing on it. After 5 years' work, I allowed myself to speculate on the subject and drew up some short notes. These I enlarged in 1844 into a sketch of the conclusions, which then seemed to me probable. From that period until the present day, I have steadily pursued the same object. I hope that I may be excused for entering on these personal details, as I give them to show that I have not been hasty in coming to a decision. That period of time he's talking about was in fact 15 years that he spent gathering more data to support this argument. Authors of the highest eminence seem to be fully satisfied with the view that each species has been independently created. To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, that the production and extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes, like those determining the birth and death of the individual. While I view all beings not as special creations, but as lineal descendants of some few things which lived long before, they seem to me to become ennobled. So this last section is from the very end. In fact, it's the last paragraphs of Darwin's book. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and so dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, which is almost implied by reproduction, variability from the indirect and direct action of the external conditions of life, a ratio of increase so high as to lead for a struggle for life, meaning so many offspring produced that they can't all survive, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having originally breathed into a few forms, or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful, it makes me want to cry, and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. One of the complaints I get sometimes from people who aren't scientists about science is that it takes the mystery out of life. And I couldn't disagree more. I think that my understanding of the natural world makes life so much richer, and there are so many mysteries to be understood. I agree with Darwin. It ennobles the world and it ennobles us. That's it. I'm Cindy Seiwert, and I read banned books.